Walks back tariffs on most products from Mexico and Canada again. Canada says retaliatory tariffs will stay in place until that pause is permanent.
A further escalation of the trade war between Canada and the United States has been narrowly avoided for now. But the back and forth threats caused the worst stock market slide in recent years.
Tensions between the U.S. and Canada are heating up as a new trade war threatens to disrupt a critical transportation route. British Columbia is considering imposing restrictions on U.S. trucks traveling to Alaska in response to American tariffs. If this standoff escalates,
the Government of Canada, following a dollar-for-dollar approach, will be imposing, as of 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, March 13, 2025, 25% reciprocal tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion of imports.
It could have serious economic and strategic consequences for both nations. Trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada have intensified due to President Trump's aggressive tariff policies. Washington's decision to impose tariffs on Canadian products, particularly dairy and lumber, has led to strong pushback from Ottawa. Canada argues that these tariffs unfairly target its economy, forcing it to explore retaliatory measures. One of the most significant responses has been the threat to restrict U.S. access to Alaska via British Columbia. This marks a new chapter in an already long history of trade disputes between the two neighbors. Unlike previous disagreements over auto parts and steel, this conflict directly affects transportation routes, making it a more complex issue. Trump's stance that the U.S. does not need Canada has further escalated tensions, with Canadian officials countering that Alaska cannot function without access through their country. If neither side backs down, this could spiral into one of the most intense economic conflicts between the two nations. The government of British Columbia has announced plans to impose tariffs or additional fees on U.S. trucks traveling to Alaska. This move is seen as direct retaliation against President Trump's tariffs on Canadian dairy and lumber imports. The province's leadership argues that if the U.S. is willing to use trade as a weapon, Canada must respond in kind. British Columbia plays a crucial role in this dispute because it controls key transit routes to Alaska. Without access through the province, U.S. trade with Alaska would be significantly disrupted. This decision has sparked concerns in Washington, particularly among businesses that rely on this trade route. While some believe this is merely a negotiating tactic to force the U.S. into lifting its tariffs, others worry that Canada is serious about implementing these measures. If enacted, the tariffs could increase costs for American businesses and create further instability in U.S.-Canada trade relations. Alaska's unique geographical position makes it highly dependent on Canadian transportation routes. As a non-contiguous U.S. state, Alaska is separated from the mainland by thousands of kilometers, requiring travel through Canada for most overland trade. The only direct alternatives would involve expensive and time-consuming maritime routes. The Canadian government is aware of this strategic leverage and is using it as a bargaining chip in its dispute with the U.S. British Columbia's potential restrictions on American trucks could significantly disrupt the supply chain for Alaska, affecting industries such as oil, seafood, and tourism. Given the harsh weather conditions and rugged terrain, road access through Canada is essential for efficient trade. This dependency places the U.S. in a difficult position. While it wants to maintain economic pressure on Canada, it cannot afford to jeopardize Alaska's economy. The question remains whether Canada will go through with its threat or use it purely for negotiation. If Canada follows through with restrictions on Alaskan trade routes, the consequences will extend beyond economic losses. The disruption of trade could lead to higher prices for essential goods in Alaska, affecting businesses and consumers alike. Additionally, Alaska holds significant strategic importance for the U.S., particularly in terms of defense. The state hosts key military installations, including air bases and naval facilities that are critical for national security. If Canada imposes transit fees or quotas, the U.S. military might face logistical challenges in transporting supplies. This raises concerns about whether the trade dispute could escalate into a broader geopolitical conflict. Furthermore, Canadian businesses could also suffer as U.S. vehicles passing through the country contribute to local economies by spending on fuel, lodging, and services. Both sides have much to lose, making negotiations crucial. The outcome of this dispute could set a precedent for future trade conflicts between the two nations. The escalating trade war has created political pressure on both sides of the border. In the U.S., lawmakers from Alaska are urging the federal government to resolve the issue quickly, warning that additional trade barriers could severely impact their state's economy. Many businesses that rely on Canadian routes are also pressuring Washington to negotiate a solution. Meanwhile, in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government is facing criticism for its handling of trade relations with the U.S. Some Canadians argue that their government has been too passive in response to Trump's aggressive policies. The British Columbia government's decision to impose fees on U.S. trucks is partly a response to domestic political demands for a stronger stance against American tariffs. Both leaders face difficult decisions. Trump must balance his tough trade rhetoric with the practical needs of Alaska, while Trudeau must decide whether to follow through with the proposed restrictions or seek a diplomatic resolution. The potential restrictions on Alaskan trade routes could also impact tourism and consumer prices. Many tourists traveling to Alaska by road must pass through Canada, and increased fees could deter travel. This could harm Alaska's tourism industry, which is a significant source of revenue for the state. Additionally, many goods transported between Alaska and the rest of the U.S. use Canadian routes. If Canada imposes tariffs or tolls, businesses will likely pass these costs on to consumers, leading to higher prices on essential goods, such as food and fuel. This could cause frustration among both American and Canadian citizens, adding further pressure on policymakers to find a resolution. The dispute highlights how interconnected the economies of the U.S. and Canada are, and how trade restrictions can have unintended consequences beyond just the immediate parties involved. If no compromise is reached, both countries could suffer from the economic fallout. Some analysts warn that Canada's move could escalate beyond an economic dispute into a more serious diplomatic or even military conflict. While outright military confrontation is unlikely, tensions between the two countries could rise if Washington perceives Canada's actions as a direct threat to national security. The U.S. relies on Alaska for strategic defense purposes, and any disruption to military logistics could provoke a strong response. If Canada imposes restrictions, the Trump administration may retaliate with further economic sanctions or legal challenges under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The situation underscores the importance of Alaska in U.S. foreign policy and raises questions about how far Canada is willing to push its leverage. While some see this as a temporary tactic to gain negotiation power, others fear that prolonged tensions could cause lasting damage to U.S.-Canada relations. Diplomatic talks will be crucial in determining the next steps. Both the U.S. and Canada stand to suffer economically if this trade dispute continues. While Canada hopes to use Alaska's geographic dependence as leverage, blocking or taxing transit routes could also hurt Canadian businesses that benefit from American trade. Many U.S. goods passing through Canada contribute to local economies, supporting jobs in transportation, fuel, and hospitality sectors. Similarly, American consumers could see higher prices on goods coming from Alaska if new tariffs or fees are imposed. The risk for both sides is that escalating trade restrictions could lead to long-term economic damage. Given how interconnected their economies are, a prolonged standoff could weaken industries on both sides of the border. The question remains whether Canada will follow through with its threats, or if this is a short-term negotiating tactic. If no resolution is reached, the dispute could set a dangerous precedent for future U.S.-Canada trade relations. The standoff between the U.S. and Canada over trade and Alaska's access highlights the fragile nature of international economic ties. Whether this dispute leads to lasting tariffs or a diplomatic resolution remains to be seen. One thing is certain: both sides have a lot at stake, and the outcome could reshape North American trade relations for years to come.